Good morning, Jason.
Good morning, Gary.
I like your shirt.
I like your shirt.
You have very good taste in shirts.
Well, thank you. You look spiffy today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for being with us again this morning. We want to take a look at the Psalms. There's so much that we can get from the Psalms, and we're just going to get a teeny tiny taste of it. But we thought that'd be a good topic to study the next few weeks, Lord willing, and see what we can get from the Psalms. There's so many different categories of Psalms. We just think of the Psalms as like a book or a novel or something, but actually there are different types of Psalms, and it helps us to understand what those different types are, because we can appreciate a whole lot more about them if we understand. There are some Psalms that are called lament Psalms or Psalms of affliction, and we're going to talk about those today. Some Psalms are called didactic. In other words, they're used to teach a lesson. There are some Psalms that are historical, and they deal with Jewish history, quite often the flight from Egypt. Some are called imprecatory, and that's a strange one for us because you're praying for vengeance on your enemies. Yeah. And that's not uncommon in David's Psalms of praying for vengeance on our enemies. Some Psalms are intercessional, where we ask for some favor, or David or someone asks for a favor. A number of them are messianic, and they point to Jesus. You mentioned to me just a minute ago that Psalm 22 is the most quoted psalm in the New Testament, and that's a very messianic psalm, because if you read that, it gives you goosebumps, because you realize that 1,000 years later, it's fulfilled word for word.
Right.
And that's really an incredible psalm. Some are penitential. They deal with sin and with forgiveness. As expected, many of the Psalms are Psalms of praise. Some of the Psalms are prophetic. They have to do with the coming Messiah. And some of the Psalms are thanksgiving and just giving God for thanks for what He has done. Some of the other Psalms are called Hallel songs, and there's a singing group, the Hallel singers, and they get that from this word, which means songs of praise. And they were often sung during the time of Passover, the night of Passover. There is an interesting group of Psalms, 8 Psalms or so, that are called pilgrimage Psalms or Psalms of ascent. And they were sung by the pilgrims, perhaps as they approached and made their way up to Jerusalem. Some of the Psalms are royal Psalms, and they talk about the reign of the earthly king as well as the heavenly king. There are a few psalms of enthronement, talk about God's sovereign rule. And then 3 of the Psalms we would classify as Psalms of wisdom. And we'll try to get a PDF of this list on the website so people can get that. And it actually breaks down each psalm into which category, and helps us understand maybe the Psalms just a little bit more. Good. You have a good example of the Psalms. I wanted to mention that the Psalms come in various forms. Sometimes they're Psalms sung by the sick or the dying. Some are Psalms of people who have been accused. Some are Psalms of people who are oppressed, and that would be probably common in the case of David. And some are laments for the penitent, people who are repenting for what they've done. And you had a real good breakdown, I think, of how to look at the Psalms.
Yeah, I think as we really kind of dive in today, just thinking about that first category of lament psalm, there's a German writer by the name of Walter Brueggemann, who had a method of interpreting or looking at lament psalms that I thought was very interesting. If you think about the normal course of life as being sort of your normal day-to-day activities, and you think of that as just being oriented in life, that's your orientation. That's how you flow through life. But then all of a sudden something comes along and disrupts that. And so all of a sudden, whether it's a sickness or financial difficulties or a natural disaster or a battle or whatever it is, comes along, and all of a sudden life is out of whack. And that's a time of disorientation. So you start in orientation, then you have a time of disorientation, and then after a while, you go through that time of difficulty, and you may never be exactly back to normal, but eventually you begin to feel life has taken on a new orientation or a new way of living. So there's this period of orientation, then disorientation, then reorientation that he proposes. And Psalms of Lament are specifically designed or specifically for us during those moments of disorientation in our lives. When things are not going the way they're supposed to be going, or not going the way that we want them to go, we have the lament psalms that speak to us, because they say what we're feeling in that time of disorientation. And so I think it's extremely appropriate now, as we're going through some of the difficulties in our nation that we're going through right now, that we take a moment to think about lament, and the fact that, 6 months ago, life was just tooling along pretty well for most of us. And the economy was good, and jobs were good, and unemployment was down, and all of those things. And then all of a sudden this virus hits, and now we're definitely in a time of disorientation, because things are not the way we want them to be. And we don't know what that new orientation is going to be later. So we can't really think ahead to what our attitude or what our world is going to be like 6 months from now. We hope we know what it's like, but we really don't know. And so how do we express that language, or what language do we use to express the way we feel during this time of disorientation?
And it really isn't hard to understand why we think this is important to this time in our history. It's just pretty obvious.
Exactly.
We just want to start out by taking a look at an example, a very familiar example of a psalm that is a lament psalm. We know it because of the song that we sing, "As the Deer Pants for the Water." That psalm is from Psalm 42. And in Psalm 42, we read this: "As the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for thee, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? My tears have been my food day and night, while they say to me all day long, Where is your God? These things I remember, and I pour out my soul within me. For I used to go along with the throng, and lead them in procession to the house of God, with a voice of joy and thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival. Why are you in despair, O my soul? And why have you become disturbed within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him for the help of his presence. O my God, my soul is in despair within me. Therefore I remember thee from the land of the Jordan, and the peaks of Hermon, from Mount Mizar. Deep calls to deep at the sound of thy waterfalls. All thy breakers and thy waves have rolled over me. The Lord will command his loving kindness in the daytime, and his song will be with me in the night, a prayer to the God of my life. I will say to God, my rock, why hast thou forsaken me? Why do I go mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? As a shattering of my bones, my adversaries revile me, while they say to me all day long, Where is your God? Why are you in despair, O my soul? And why have you become disturbed within me? Hope in God, for I shall yet praise him, the help of my countenance and my God. And so it's easy to see that pattern there as David goes in. Everything's fine. He's used to leading these processions and everything, and all of a sudden things are disoriented in his life. Mm-hmm. And he faces a time of reorientation when God puts him back on the right path. It's wonderful to take a look at the Old Testament, the Psalms, and see how they compare or contrast sometimes with some of the statements that we find in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. One example of that is Psalm 88. In verse 1, it says, O Lord, the God of my salvation, I have cried out by day and in the night before thee. And that sounds familiar from Luke chapter 18, where Jesus is telling the parable about the unjust judge, the unrighteous judge, and contrasting that to God. And Jesus says in that parable, Now shall not God bring about justice for his elect, who cry to him day and night, and will he delay long over them? And one interesting thing about comparing the Psalms with the New Testament is the New Testament often has an added element. And that added element is this reassurance that we have. In the Old Testament, David just says, I've cried out to thee day and night. But Jesus here adds, won't God take care of you if you do that? Another one is just a few verses later in Psalm 88:14. And in that psalm it says, O Lord, why dost thou reject my soul? Why dost thou hide thy face from me? And that sounds familiar to us from what Jesus says on the cross. And here again, that's that added element. It's Jesus who's saying it now, not David, not some human. But Jesus is saying it in Matthew 27, verse 46. And about the ninth hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? That is, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? There's another comparison that we find in Romans, or in Psalm 44, verse 22. The psalm says, "But for thy sake we are killed all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered." And see what David does with that statement in Romans chapter 8, beginning in verse 35. "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? Just as it is written, for thy sake we are being put to death all day long. We were considered as sheep to be slaughtered. But in all these things we overwhelmingly conquer through him who loved us." And so there's kind of a little bit of a twist there in the New Testament. Paul adds that assurance that we don't have to wait a long time to get that reassurance that God is there for us and Jesus is there for us and they're there with us. There's so much good instruction found in all the Psalms, and that's true of the Lament Psalms. One example is in the 55th Psalm. In verse 22 it says, "Cast your burden upon the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never allow the righteous to be shaken." Peter says something similar in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 6 and 7, where he says, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety upon him, because he cares for you." Another example is in Psalm 56 and verse 4. It says, "In God, whose word I praise, in God I have put my trust. I shall not be afraid. What can mere men do to me?" The Hebrew writer again says something similar in chapter 13, verses 5 and 6. He says, "Let your character be free from the love of money, being content with what you have. For he himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you. So that we confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What shall man do to me?" It's not hard to see how applicable these lament psalms are to us today. The New Testament writers actually quote these lament psalms and apply them to the Christian age. Right. And so there's an amazing amount of encouragement and reassurance in those psalms. I just want to take a look at one more passage from Psalm 66 because I think it's very applicable to Christians always, and it's applicable to us today, of course. It says, "Hear my cry, O God, give heed to my prayer. From the end of the earth I call to thee. When my heart is faint, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. For thou hast been a refuge for me, a tower of strength against the enemy. Let me dwell in thy tent forever. Let me take refuge in the shelter of thy wings." And that's another one of those psalms that's very applicable today, and it gives us reassurance. Mm-hmm. I think we want to take a look at Psalm 13. You had that as an example.
Right. Psalm 13 kind of can stand as a sort of a model of the lament psalms for us. And it strikes me as you were going through some of those, some of the psalms can have characteristics of more than one type of formatting or more than one type of characterization. Like Psalm 22 is definitely a messianic psalm, but it also has elements of lament. Mm-hmm. And so many of these psalms we may use a number of times as we go through this study to talk about different characteristics. But Psalm 13 stands as kind of a model psalm of lament, and it's a short one. It's only about 6 verses, I think, but it has the formatting that we want to see for the next few minutes here. So Psalm 13 reads, "How long, O Lord, wilt thou forget me forever? How long wilt thou hide thy face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Enlighten my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemy say, I have overcome him. Lest my adversaries rejoice when I am shaken. But I have trusted in thy loving kindness. My heart shall rejoice in thy salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." So there are 5 elements that we want to notice in this psalm. There's first the address. And in a psalm of lament, usually the address is very short. And here in verse 1, the address is, "O Lord." There's not time for flowery language. There's not time for sprucing things up because I'm hurting. My life is falling apart, and God, I need to have your attention. And so he again says in verse 3, he addresses God one more time, "O Lord my God." And compare that to some of the Psalms of praise or some of the Psalms of thanksgiving when the address is effusive and it's very flowery. But with lament, it's short and it's very succinct. Another element in lament psalms is the complaint, and this is the description of what's wrong. Why is my life in disorientation right now? And this is the reason for the lament. And typically, there are three aspects to that. First, there's an I aspect. There's how does this affect me, and you see that in verse 2 of Psalm 13 when he says, "How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart all the day long?" It's all about me. How is this affecting me? There's also often an element of them. Here's how somebody else has hurt me. And in this psalm, verse 2, the enemy, there's an enemy. He says, "How long will my enemy be exalted over me?" And so there's a complaint about how the enemy is being elevated above him. And then there's also sometimes a you section. And this is a complaint that maybe makes us feel a little uncomfortable because it's usually a complaint against God. Either for something he has done that we don't like, or for something that he hasn't done or has allowed to happen that we don't like. And in verse 1, it says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" Well, I think in our moments of rational thinking, we know that God doesn't forget us. We know that he doesn't turn his back on us. And yet sometimes when we're in that time of disorientation, it feels that way. And so when we're calling out to God in this moment of lament, it's appropriate in this context to cry out to God and say, "Here I am. Where are you?" So there's the address, the complaint. The next portion is the plea. And here's what I want you to do about the situation. God, I've got your attention. I've called, I've let my complaint be known. Now here's what I want to happen. And in verse 3, "Consider and answer me, O Lord my God, enlighten my eyes." Help me to understand what's going on here, God. I don't get it. I don't understand how this is part of your will, but I want to understand. So my goal here is for you to make this known to me. There's often a fourth part, which is motivation. Why should God do what is requested? You know, God is in charge, and why should he listen to me, and why should he hear my plea? And this often is accompanied by an appeal to God as to who he is or what his character is, and that his character needs to be protected by him doing something on my behalf. And if you look at verses 3 and 4, it says, "Lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest my enemies say, I have overcome him, lest my adversaries rejoice when I am shaken." God, if I am your person, if I am your man, and you allow my enemies victory over me, what are they going to think of you? And what is that going to say about you as my protector if you allow them this victory? And so there's that motivation for God to act on our behalf to overcome the situation. And then finally, the fifth part is a statement of confidence or praise, thanking God for what he is going to do, knowing that he's going to act, knowing that it's going to be okay in the end, even though it may not feel like it in the moment, but knowing that it is, and thanking God ahead of time for what he is going to do. And in Psalm 13, there's verses 5 and 6, "But I have trusted in thy loving kindness. My heart shall rejoice in thy salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." Well, if you read the first 4 verses, it doesn't sound like there's much bounty going on, but there's an acknowledgement of what God has done and what God will continue to do as part of that statement of confidence or praise at the end of the lament psalm. So, lament, those are the categories or the characteristics of a lament psalm and how it breaks down. And the question that remains, I think, is there a place for lament in the lives of Christians today? We don't express ourselves this way. We don't talk this way very often. In fact, some would say, the New Testament tells us rejoice in the Lord always, and again I will say rejoice. And so if we're not constantly rejoicing, and we're taking a moment or a break from that rejoicing to lament, then we are not doing something right. But I think we see from these examples and the things we've talked about today that lament is a language of faith. It takes a lot of faith to tell God exactly what you're thinking and exactly what you're feeling. Because let's face it, we can't hide that from him. If I pretend to rejoice when I'm really not feeling it because I'm disturbed or I'm anxious or I'm fearful of something, God knows that fear is there. He knows that anxiety is there. How much better for us to acknowledge that to him and to turn it over to him through that language of lament.
Excellent. And we did, as usual, we have some questions. Did you have some questions that you thought of? Or
I think yours are
a few
good.
that I thought of. The first one was the format of the lament psalms, because it's important to understand what you just said about this format. And as we read them, we notice those things and they stand out, and the whole thing fits together as a unit. One question you want to ask yourself then is, what's this format? Another question is, what was the purpose for the lament psalms then? But along with that, another question is, how can that understanding help us today? And how can that help us in our lives? And as you were talking, I thought of another question. And that question is, if I were to write a lament psalm today, what would it sound like?
Okay.
What if each one of us would sit down and write our own lament psalm? What would it look like? We would address God, and they would have all those elements, the plea and the description of what happened, and down to the confidence that God is going to answer it. What would our lament psalm look like, I wonder, today?
That's an interesting question. That brings to mind a memory or two from my past in some schooling, some classes that I've had. One of my professors said that he would often give his students an assignment of writing a psalm after going through many of these, and it surprised him the first few times he did that, the number of students that wrote lament psalms by choice. And it usually was because of personal things that were going on in their lives, whether it was relationship things or sickness or whatever the case. But many people chose to write lament psalms without being told to. And then another study through the same teacher actually that has been done, that when you go through our songbooks and you look at how our songs are classified, when you look at the Psalms, which are the songbook of the Old Testament, the overwhelming majority of those are lament psalms compared to other categories. But in our songbooks, almost no lament psalms.
Right.
Almost nothing to give us voice when we are feeling that time of disorientation. It's all about praise and thanksgiving, which is good.
Yeah, they have a good place, but
but we need that language of lament.
We do.
We need to be able to express ourselves in moments of disorientation.
And so maybe our challenge this week or sometime, just sit down and write our own lament psalm. What would it look like?
What would it look like? That would be interesting. I bet mine would be short. I don't like to write.
Okay. Well, thank you again for being here. The outline and the questions will be on the website, and we hope that you'll take a look at those, and hope that you'll be back tonight as we continue to study the Bible together, and hope you can make it to our One Circles
Yes,
tonight.
that was good.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.